Welcome to the Styleframe Saturdays podcast. I'm your host, Caroline Lee. Join me as I take a deep dive into the wonderful world of style frames and interview those who are industry wizards when it comes to this stage of the animated production process. For those who may not know, style frames are pieces of creative that are developed during the pre-production phase of an animation project, and they help creators and clients alike get an idea of the overall style of a piece. Sometimes the initial vision is carried through to the end, and other times it ends up on the cutting room floor. During this podcast, we'll discuss projects of all shapes and sizes, and the challenges, rewards, and lessons learned while developing what I like to call each guest's favorite frame. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, this podcast would not be possible without the help from Riverside and Anchor. They're the Styleframe Saturdays podcasting tools of choice, and if you're interested in learning more about their capabilities, we've got a couple of links in today's show notes for you to check out. As we wrap up season 1, we'd like to give a big shout out to our good friend Sean Foster. He's been our go-to audio, video, and lighting guy, has jumped into edit, and has single-handedly helped us transform the podcast throughout our first year. Please go give his channel a view for video production tips, streaming, and gaming fun. We'll be sure to drop a link to his channel in today's show notes for you to check out as well. So now that you know how we're getting this podcast to you, let's dive into today's episode. Today's guest is an amazing art director and 3D artist. He's worked with some incredible brands, including Honda, NASA, and TEDx, and has also contributed to some amazing films as well. He has a true knack for bringing any product or service or experience to life with CGI, so I'm pumped to talk all things 3D with him today. Please help me in welcoming Jesus Suarez to the show. Hey, Jesus, thank you for joining me on the show today. How's everything going?
Hello, Caroline. Thank you. I'm doing well, and I'm super excited to be here.
No, cool. It's my pleasure to have you. I know we've gotten to know each other over the past few years, and I've been a big fan of your work for the longest time. So I'm ecstatic that you're here to join us today and join us on the finale of season 1 of the podcast.
Yes.
But let's jump right into things if that's okay with you. For anyone who doesn't know you, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself, perhaps a little bit about your story and how you got into the field of animation and motion design?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So I'm an art director and 3D artist, originally from Venezuela, but I reside in the United States, and my beginnings with the industry are a little bit funny. Actually, I started going to engineering school because my dad is a civil engineer, so just trying to follow the steps. I quickly realized that wasn't for me, so I basically stayed there for like 6 months. I really went to school for like 2 months. I realized it wasn't for me, so the rest of the time I was just going to hang out with friends and even play video games. There was like a video chat thing close to school, but in doing that, I met somebody a guy that used Photoshop, and he was kind of like on the same page as me. Like he didn't want to pursue the career, so he is the one that introduced me to Photoshop, and that's what got me started into all of this. I started doing some like photo montages of like pictures with friends and stuff like that, and then decided to make the change for a visual communications degree back home in Venezuela.
Oh, very cool. And then, I know a majority of the work that I see online in terms of your portfolio and everything is very 3D based now. So were you doing any of that 3D stuff, or did you kind of just pick that up as you kind of got into your career?
No, actually, because I was going to, the degree was for visual communications. It was mostly based around like graphic design, like logotypes, branding, and stuff like that. We had a couple of classes for animation and like video editing, but I didn't really get into it a lot. It was only afterwards when I came here to the United States, I went to Full Sail University, that I wanted to, continue studying. And they actually gave us a 3ds Max, and I hated it. So I promised myself that I would never touch 3D. So at the time I was only doing After Effects, like 2D animation work, like characters and illustrated stuff. But then eventually I discovered Cinema 4D and, started, and actually Octane also came around. So that's when I started to, make the pivot to 3D. And nowadays I prefer to work in 3D and not do a lot of like 2D animation. It's weird. It's like phases, it goes up and down. So
Wow, no, that's really interesting. And if you don't mind me asking, what year was it that you kind of got introduced to Cinema 4D and Octane? Because I could be wrong on this, but I feel like Octane, in terms of like these sort of GPU renders, feels like it's one of the more recent things.
Yeah, so Cinema 4D, I got introduced to that in my last year of Full Sail. Full Sail is a bachelor's degree that's compressed into 21 months. So it's
Okay.
not really 4 years, it's 21 months. So yeah, my last year would be like the second one or something like that. But anyways, yeah, I got introduced into that. And at the time we were using just like standard rendered, I think not pro render, physical wasn't even around. And yeah, I think Octane, that was 2012. Octane came
Okay.
around 2015, I think.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, so I spent a couple of years just using the regular Cinema 4D renderer, which was a pain. And obviously, discovering Octane was like a, breath of fresh air for sure.
That's what every 3D designer says. They're just like, once that
Yeah.
thing came on the market, they're like, oh, thank God.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, speaking of 3D, I'd love to chat about the frame that you're sharing with us today. Could you tell us a little bit about the piece that you've selected?
Yes, of course. So this one was a piece that I did for my Patreon. I have a Patreon where I, share my insights and my knowledge with the community. And this one is very dear to me because it's like a remix of an older frame that I did for just like personal exploration. And I wanted to do it this way just to, test myself and see how far I've, come along in this past 2 years from when that first frame was revealed. The brand is Rama Works, and that one is also really important to me because I participated in a commercial video for the product. Not this one, but another keyword. And yeah, I just wanted to make something that looked pretty cool, that aligns with like my interest nowadays, which is like really moody lighting like this, high contrast, and just see how much I could push, just like the realism and the look, art direction of things.
Very cool. Well, before we jump into some of the like workflow details of this personal piece that you've
Sure.
selected, I don't know if you had a creative brief that you kind of gave yourself for this, but if you did, could you kind of walk us through it and how you kind of approached it with this personal
Hmm.
project?
Well, I can tell you where my mind was when I was doing the first round of this project, because it was actually a bigger project in the sense that it wasn't just a frame. The idea was to like take this small keyboard, I think it's called a macro keyboard, and just like try to do different explorations. Thinking like I was maybe going to pitch this to the client, for example.
Okay.
So the brief was very open. Obviously, it's a product, so we want to see everything, in the beautiful lighting, good materials, and of course, the logo. And yeah, for this one, it was more about like showing the features of the product. Obviously, it has a rectangular shape or a square shape, and try to use, make use of really high contrast with the colors in order to make the product pop even more, and just give the logo just a little bit of focus, but not like be completely in your face.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, you can definitely visually see that in this frame, and it's which is really cool.
Thank
Um,
you.
your process for a personal project like this, like where do you start? Because I think you had said, this is kind of like a challenge in some sort of respect.
Yes.
Do you start all the way at mood boards and go into storyboards, or and then from there jump into the framing and animation, or do you just kind of simply jump into something like Cinema 4D and start playing around right away?
I think it varies. Sometimes I do like I feel inspired to just like explore something, and at that point I just jump into Cinema 4D and see what comes out of it. I'm not a huge believer that everything has to have a meaning. Like at least for me, I can just create an image sometimes just because of enjoying the process and seeing what comes out of it, and not necessarily has to have a deeper meaning. But for something like this, I started with just obviously gathering reference, trying to come up with an idea, which obviously was to use the product and present it in different environments and angles and whatnot, and yeah, gather reference. And for this one, I think I did do a couple of like rough sketches, which is not something that I do very often because I can't draw very much. For me, it's easier to maybe think of an angle or something like that and just jump into Cinema 4D, even if it is using just cubes. But the ability to have the camera and move around is easier for me than to represent it with drawing, because obviously my skills are not up to par for that, and I get very frustrated very quickly because I'm trying to draw something that I see on my head, but my skill doesn't really allow for that. So yeah, sometimes I just jump into Cinema 4D. Most of the time, I try to take my time, do a little bit of research, see what's out there, so I don't like completely repeat something that's been done already, and just try to have fun with it and explore. I think that's
Very
the most important part.
Very cool. Yeah. What you said about the whole kind of like blocking aspect of it, I thought was really interesting too. And this, for the most part, I feel like is a pretty straightforward in terms of geometry. It's pretty
Yes.
straightforward. Like you said, it's a couple of cubes. You're kind of blocking out the framing with cameras and stuff. Um, so this is a little bit off topic from this particular frame, but I'd love to talk about this whole blocking aspect with you a little bit, because you also recently completed some frames for another project that had a lot of like organic textures in it. And
Yeah.
so knowing that this is kind of part of your workflow now, how do you approach that blocking in terms of the complexity of the geometry that's in the scene? Are you just really just kind of taking big broad shapes and kind of placing them all over the scene to kind of get a feel of how the composition is going to be, or are you getting a little detailed as you're starting to block those things out?
For sure. I'm gonna get a little bit technical with Cinema 4D, but I think it's important just to showcase what my approach is. So usually when I start a project like this, and specifically for something like a product, and I don't have the product, for example, or it needs to be modeled or whatever, the way that I like to approach it is that I make a null object with with a child object, and that would be the thing that I'm going to instance. So that way I instance in this example would be just a rough cube. But later when I put everything together with the camera angle and whatnot. It's an instance object. So when I do get the object or the product, I just need to replace it in that null object. And it's not like I need to resize everything or whatever. So that's the way that I do it. And yes, I usually try to keep everything as procedural as possible. If I don't have access to like the final object, and or I don't have an idea of the of how the final shape would look, and that's more about the other frame that you were talking about with the walls and stuff like that. That's like I had the idea for the walls, but obviously until I go into Cinema 4D and push the object, I don't really know how it's going to look. So in the beginning, it's just, yeah, like you're saying, two rough shapes, cubes or spheres or whatever, just to um, give me a sense of what it would look later in the composition.
Very cool. Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear, and definitely feel free to get very technical with some of the stuff too as we continue to talk about this frame and your
Sure.
work in general, because it's really cool to hear how different artists and designers approach their work, whether that's, through broadly talking about the creative behind it or the inspiration behind it or the referencing behind it, but then also the technical aspect of it too. Like Photoshop, Cinema 4D, there's like a million ways to do the same
Oh
thing.
yeah,
So,
for sure.
yeah, very cool to hear that. Well, speaking of this frame too, and your work in general, when it comes to photorealism, you have that down to a science.
Oh,
And so I
thank
was
you.
wondering, seriously, you really do. So I was wondering, what are some of the first questions you ask yourself, or what are some of the first things that you're thinking about when you approach a photorealistic project like this one?
I think the most important question is the balance between lighting and materials. That to me is what gives it the I always use the word like tactile for something like this. For example, I really wanted it to feel like you could probably like touch, or just by seeing the material you kind of know what type of surface it is. And that's something that comes with just using like imperfection maps and adding just like tiny bump maps that gives just a little bit of imperfection to the surface, so that it's not completely smooth. Obviously, that's not the case most of the time, because clients want to see their products like look completely clean, but I always try to add just a little bit of imperfection. Like you can see it there in the metal, where the logo is. There's just a little bit of imperfection, not that it looks dirty, but that it looks like it's a you know it's a real object that has been touched or something like that.
No, for sure. Yeah, and you can see that clear as day in this frame too. Um, Going off of that though, the lighting and the texturing and shading aspect of it, how important is it then to be in sort of a real world type of scale? Is that
Mhm.
important? What's your feeling or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's important. I don't think that it should be like just a rule that's always that you abide to that rule all the time, because sometimes you do need to bend the rules in order to get the image that you want. For example, in the beginning of the year, I was working in a project where we had a product, but we wanted very, very soft shadows. So we did try. You know how it works. So if the light is very far away and small, the shadows are going to be harder, and if it's a big light source and closer to the object, or just big in general, the shadows are going to be smaller. And we were doing that, but we weren't getting really the feeling that we wanted. Obviously, we had the product in a real world scale, but in the end we had to make the product like even bigger than a human being in 3D for the shadows and the look to feel a little bit more soft, and just bend the rules in that sense so that the image looks better. I think obviously the main goal in the end is to get the final image that you want, and it is good to know the rules, but it's also good to sometimes to just bend those rules and break those rules for sure.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where your sort of art directing expertise kind of comes in too, because, I am a Patreon or a Patreon of your Patreon. I don't know.
Patron of a pet, yes.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying it right. So, I have been fortunate to be able to kind of see the breakdown of this piece that we're talking about today. And I
Oh,
know that
thank you
you
so
had
much for your support.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And the one of the things that you did talk about, I won't give away too much, but
Yeah,
we talk about the subsurface scattering element in this piece as well. And so when we were just talking about scale, and your art direction capabilities, I was just curious, like, if that's something that you really have to kind of like keep in mind constantly when you're using those types of materials, because
yeah,
like you had said, it really does affect kind of like the amount of light that's kind of bouncing in and around those materials. So just curious,
yeah.
how you kind of feel about scale in terms of art direction with those types of materials as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, contradicting a little bit of what I just said, I always try to just get, the human figure in my scene, and just, play around with the scale based on that. Obviously, if you're using something like subsurface scattering, scale is really important, because that really is going to dictate the math behind everything. So yeah, obviously scale is important, but it really depends on what you need to get out of the image. If it's a product, or I would say, yeah, start with making it real world scale, and just bend the rules to what your main objective is.
That makes so much sense. Absolutely. So you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the show that this was a piece that you kind of did an iteration of one time ago, and then that this is the newer version.
Yeah.
When did you do the black and white version of this product?
The black and white version was done, I think, 2 years ago,
2 years.
or a year and a
Okay.
half.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I was just curious for reference. Yeah, because again, you can totally see that the lighting and the shading and is very different.
Yeah.
Just curious, what made you, when you kind of came back to this project, what made you kind of artistically kind of go in this sort of more orange and warm type of direction?
Yeah, definitely. It was just looking at the older version, which is very monochromatic, in every aspect. And I felt like maybe the product could stand out a little bit more, like pop out of the background a little bit more. And my approach is usually just for things like lighting and colors. It's just experimenting, seeing through the camera, experimenting with different lightings. Obviously, to get to this point, It took me about 3 or 4 hours of just like moving lights around, adjusting materials and whatnot. In the beginning, the idea was to do the same thing with the keyboard. What do you call it? Um, the thing is that you click. What do you call it? On
The
the keyboard?
the keys?
The keys, yes, the keys, keyboard keys. Okay. In the beginning, the idea was to, just redo the same materials with the new Redshift, but then it wasn't looking as exciting as I thought it would. So that's where I started to experiment with different colors and whatnot. And orange really stood out to me. Orange is what I use for my branding as well. So it's a color that I really like, and obviously it goes in phases too. Sometimes I like green, and right now it's orange. So
Oh, very cool. Well, this might then answer this question that I have too, but I'll ask it anyway. What typically drives some of your design decisions when it comes to lighting and texturing? I know for this, you just said that, like orange is kind of part of your branding and everything. So maybe that
yeah.
had something to do with it. But in general, just curious what your response might be.
What drives my lighting? Yeah, I really like lighting like this, where you have really harsh shadows, or not harsh shadows, but there's a really good contrast between light and shadows. I think that it creates really like a mood or something that you can identify with the piece, or at least I do. So usually I tend to gravitate towards that. Um, in the past 2 years or so, I was doing a lot of like really dark lighting stuff with a lot of like dark backgrounds and stuff like that. So now I moved on to something more like this, where there's shadows and there's brightness, but everything has a little bit of a more of a balance. So I guess I go with experimenting with different kind of stuff. For example, for the other piece that you were talking about with the basketball player, the idea was to present him in like a zen space. So for that, you really want like a lot of lighting, soft lighting, and it really depends on yeah, again, the final image that you're trying to, or the mood that you're trying to convey, for sure.
No, absolutely. That makes complete sense. Well, to follow up on that last lighting question, again, while I was watching the breakdown of this piece on your Patreon, I thought it was interesting that you highlight that your approach to lighting in 3D initially was to kind of mimic the real world. And I know
Yeah.
we've just touched upon this a little bit in terms of being accurate with scale and stuff. Um, but that is advice that you hear quite often when working in 3D. But you also did mention that, that approach was maybe preventing you from improving your renders at the same time. So that now your approach to lighting has kind of morphed into a combination of understanding how the real world works, but also
Yeah.
kind of like you said, bend the rules. So how has a realization like this kind of affected your concept design process? Have you noticed a difference in the pre-production part of your pipeline since making a change like this to your workflow?
I don't think I've noticed a difference in the pre-production part, but I definitely know I have noticed a difference in the quality of my renders and my projects. For the longest time, I was just trying to do exactly that. Like, how would I light this in the real world and just abide to those rules? But it wasn't until like working with different types of, or with different people in different studios, that you start to share different files and whatnot, and you open a file and there's 80 different lights for something like this, and I'm like, whoa, what is happening here? So you dissect the file, like reverse engineer it, and you realize, oh, so I don't really have to obey those rules. I can just know them, but use the fact that I'm in 3D to just take that into my advantage, and really like light everything the way that I want it to, even if it's not like 100% real world accurate. So I think that realization has really helped me to just continue progressing forward with 3D in general, for sure.
Definitely. And you mentioned something similar about what types of camera lengths, focal lengths
Yeah.
to use as well. So I'm sure it's kind of a similar approach, but again, how do you know what camera focal lengths to use in your pieces then as well? Like what kind of guides those decisions?
So for the focal length, I usually gravitate towards a longer lens, just because I really like how it compresses everything and really like showcases the shape of things. But it really depends on what the project is. For example, if you're doing like a commercial for like a sports team, all of those commercials with animations and whatnot make everything look like larger than life. So for something like that, you need to be really close with your camera, and it needs to be a shallow lens so that everything looks, just like ex- uh, extended and yeah, larger than life. But for something like this, it really is about like showcasing the product in its best form. And I think longer focal lengths help with that. Obviously, if you're doing like a portrait or something, that really depends on what you're doing. But I think it comes with experience. Like nowadays, just the 36 millimeter camera is not really enough for like the default camera that you get in Cinema 4D when you add a camera. So I always tend to gravitate towards like 50 or more. But it depends if I'm trying to do something a little bit more dynamic, for example, like I was saying, for a sports brand or something like that.
For sure. And to kind of go back a little bit, you had mentioned you had this degree in visual communications and stuff. I'm not sure if there are any photography classes involved in the curriculum or not, but do you have do you do photography on the side? Do you have a knowledge of photography that kind of helps you kind of
Yeah.
with your art direction type of decisions when it comes to like these with the framing and composition within your 3D pieces?
Yeah, we definitely had photography classes. I did enjoy them, and I have tried to just explore photography more as like a hobby and whatnot. And I know some like techniques and basics about photography. Obviously, that really helps when working in 3D, because you are also working with cameras. So depth of field, shutter speed and stuff like that really helps. But I tend to take more of like the artistic approach. I'm not really good with like technical numbers, and this needs to be like exactly this number for this to work. I prefer to just mess around with sliders and whatnot, and just trust my eye and my instinct, or somebody else's. Like if I'm working in a studio, obviously I get feedback from creative directors and other people, or I just ask friends for their feedback and then just go from there.
Very cool.
Hopefully that answers your question. I don't know that it does, but
Yeah, no, it does. And I think it speaks to, art directing in general too. Again, I kind of feel like there's a theme maybe to like, the discussion we're having now where it's sort of like you kind of know how the real world works.
yeah,
You observe it, you know why things look a certain way. But you have to bend the rules a little bit because,
yeah.
how something works in the real world, how you're trying to showcase it in terms of a, sort of 3D program, 2D program, or what have you. Yeah, you kind of have to bend those rules a little bit because, the eye is funny, it can just kind of pick up where like, oh, that looks a little bit off. And you
Yes.
kind of have to bend the rules to make it look like it's actually kind of accurate, which is interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I was curious about the product itself a little bit.
Mhm.
I was wondering if there was some hidden symbolism with some of the elements. I believe you talked about it a little bit in your Patreon breakdown, but I couldn't remember exactly. And I think you had mentioned it at the top of the show too. So so remind me again. This is a product for.
Yeah, so this is imagine it's like a little keyboard that you keep on the side of your desk, and you can assign
Okay.
different things to each one of the keys to do. For example, you can assign it to open like Zoom for a meeting, or hide your camera or mute your microphone. So it's really a macro key, so you can assign whatever you want to those keys in general.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So, maybe that answers this a little bit then. But, when you look at the two compositions side by side, like in the black and white version, you see the insides of the keys,
Yes.
the kind of mechanicalness of them, if you will. And in the more newer version, you don't, it's more kind of like the subsurface scattering texture. It kind of just feels like a little bit more rubbery solid and everything. So I was just curious, with regards to some of these changes, what drove some of these compositional changes?
Yeah, I think it was just about making the product look a little bit more yeah, dynamic and attractive. Obviously, in the previous version, I don't think the product looks bad, but overall, I think the image is a little bit too simple, and in terms of lighting, it's just very even. So the idea here was to just make it more impactful, I would say, because if you think about it, people that own these kind of products really like to customize the keys, and they have maybe even different colors for the keys and whatnot. So yeah, the idea was to make it a little bit more impactful in that sense.
Oh, that's cool. No, yeah, that's really cool to know. And I can see, you can totally see it too. Like, yeah, the lighting is a little bit more uniform in the previous
Yeah,
version, but this one, yeah, a lot more dramatic. And I would even say that there's like, it appears that you're intentionally obscuring, but also kind of revealing certain elements as well. So that's why I wanted to ask. I just think it's really
yeah, for
cool.
sure. And most of the time, the type of lighting that I have in the previous frame, it's good for products because you're just showcasing um, the vast amount of features of the product. But yeah, in this one, I wanted to have a little bit more fun and make it, like you're saying, maybe a little bit more mysterious, but also, impactful with the colors and obscuring things and trying to guide the eye to just explore the frame a little bit more.
For sure. No, absolutely. Well, I know this was a personal piece, and it was something that you worked on a couple of years before and then kind of came back to again. But throughout that whole time, whether it was the previous version or this newer version, did you give yourself any constraints while working on this personal project?
Uh, I think, well, for the first one, because it was a series of images that you can actually find on my website. The idea was to try to finalize it in a month, but obviously that becomes very difficult when you start working with clients, and I have a daughter too, so it's not like I want to spend 8 hours on the computer and then 4 more hours, 5 more hours at night working on these things. So it's hard to find the time to work on personal projects, and I try to be a little bit more flexible with myself, because obviously there's a lot of pressure from what you see on social media and whatnot. Everybody's creating so much good stuff that you feel pressure to just continue to put out work. So lately I've been trying to be a little bit more flexible with myself, and just work on these things as I have time, try to enjoy the process and not really focus too much on a hard deadline, because honestly there doesn't need to be a hard deadline. But to really answer your question with this one, obviously I did have just a window of time to work on it, record my process, which, like I mentioned on Patreon, I recorded the whole thing because the idea was to just do it in one sitting and show everyone on Patreon my complete process, but it was over 2 hours long. So I don't think anyone has the time, or patience to sit down and watch me, work on an image for 2 hours. So after that, I had to re-record, the breakdown of the piece. So in that sense, because it was for Patreon, I did put myself like the deadline of like, or yeah, it was like I think 2 days for working on this one. But most of the time, I try to just enjoy the process and work on stuff as I have time. Yeah,
Very
and try
cool.
to enjoy it.
Yeah, no, well, that's the most important thing, right? Like I think that's why we all are kind of in this industry. We love what we do, and I'm sure there's a ton of people who put in a lot of hours because
Yes.
it's just such a passion. So to kind of to go back to what you were saying earlier, like that maybe it started out as an idea of, well, I just kind of want to see what I can do and kind of this short time frame. I think that's great because it kind of allows you to kind of assess, which obviously you have been able to do with the previous version compared to this newer version. Show like, oh hey, look, like I'm improving this, or this looks a little bit better, and yeah, personal projects don't have to be these enormous big
Yeah.
things. It's great. I mean, some people are doing really big, great, big personal projects, and that's
Yes.
great too. But these little kind of like check-ins to kind of just see like where you're at in terms of your own sort of personal timeline and career, I think are really great too. And I think that's why I'm so excited that you decided to share this piece today, because I do feel like because we live in this world where there's just so much talent, like you said,
So much.
constantly on social media. It's kind of hard to not compare from time to time,
Oh yeah.
and that can be a stressor in and of itself, because you're sort of like, I'm not up to date on the latest software, I'm not up to date on the latest trends in the industry, and that can kind of even be limiting too, because then you might not even want to like jump into a personal piece, like, oh, I don't have enough time, I need to do like a really big thing. But
Yeah.
you showcasing this piece kind of shows that like you don't, you can make your personal project whatever size and duration it needs to be for you to kind of like, get your creative juices flowing. So I think it's really cool to hear that, for you, this little piece was something that's been really impactful, and like, kind of like holds a special place in your heart, because,
Yeah.
it kind of gives you a kind of visualization of how your career has been progressing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really important because it's something that I've been, battling with for, and I'm sure, as you being in this industry, the work that we do is commercial, but it's also a really fine line with like the hobby kind of part of
Yes,
things. So it's really easy to just get lost in that sense and not enjoy other parts of life. And that's something that I've been trying to actively, be mindful of. Like, yes, I do have a working day, but I also have a family. I also have other interests that I need to take care of, and also my health. So it's not healthy to be on the computer for 12 hours a day. So yeah, it's important.
absolutely. For sure. No, truer words have never been spoken. Well, this piece I believe was built entirely in Cinema 4D, but as a 3D artist and designer, I'm just curious. Obviously Cinema 4D, Redshift, Octane are part of your toolkit. What are some of your go-to sort of 3D applications and plugins that you typically use on projects?
So I recently discovered this plugin from EJ Hasenfratz called Light Solo, and I recommend everyone getting it. It's for Cinema 4D, and it's essentially does what it says. You select a light, click the plugin, and it turns off everything else, and it's really useful for lighting scenarios. Um, but my go-tos are, like you're saying, Cinema 4D, Redshift. I do want to try to get into Octane a little bit more lately. I've been trying it out on and off, and it's been a lot better in the past year or so. So I do want to try to experiment more with that. I downloaded Houdini 2 years ago. Haven't opened it.
I
Haven't
was
really
wondering
had the
when this was going to
time.
come up.
Yeah, that's the one thing that's like hovering over everyone's head, isn't it? Just learning Houdini. But yeah, I haven't really found the time to do that. I even bought a course for it, but yeah, I just haven't been able to find the time, because if it's not commercial work, then it's personal projects, or in my case, obviously, I do have to create content for Patreon. If it's not that, then it's my daughter, and I do want to be active, and a present dad for her, so that's important to me too. So it's tough to find the time for doing those kind of things. What else? I use, obviously, After Effects and Premiere. I did try for a little bit to use DaVinci. It's a cool program, but I think for my workflow, Premiere works better just because of the integration with everything else. And this year, I want to try Substance Painter a little bit more,
Very
and
cool.
Designer I did try a while ago, but obviously that's more focused for somebody that really like creates materials and textures from scratch. Substance Designer. So yeah, I'm gonna try Painter and see how it goes, and hopefully I don't have to move to Houdini now that Cinema 4D is updating their cloth and simulation systems. I don't know. We'll see.
I know that was like a big thing. I think that's what everyone's been talking about lately, is that like the cloth simulations are like way better. I haven't tested them
Yeah,
out myself personally, but just seeing it all over Twitter and Instagram, I've seen a couple of comments that have said, oh, maybe actually I'm okay in just Cinema 4D. I don't have to jump over to
yeah.
Houdini, but there are a lot of Houdini enthusiasts out there too
Oh yeah,
who will
yeah, yeah.
convince you otherwise.
Houdini is a different beast for sure.
What would you say, going back to this project then, what would you say is the biggest challenge and reward about working on this piece?
um, what is the biggest challenge? I think the biggest challenge for me in this one was just trying to get the type of lighting that I was kind of seeing in my head. Again, I'm not that kind of artist that I go to sleep and I wake up and I know exactly what I need to do. And that's it's interesting because I did try to do like live streams for a while, and I discovered that for me it doesn't really work just because of that. I go back and forth a lot between different setups, and it's hard to just constrain myself to 1 or 2 hours and coming up with a final piece. So I think that's mainly usually that's the challenge, just moving lights around and trying to find a way to convey a mood that I'm trying to convey. It would be yeah, that's the biggest challenge. I usually just like move lights for a while before I start to see something that really goes with what I want to present. And what was the other part of the question?
And the biggest reward of working on this
The
piece.
biggest reward was getting that product to look the way that it looks. I think it looks very pleasing and it looks fun with the combination of colors, and just yeah, just being able to use the new Redshift materials and whatnot is really easy, and it's more artist friendly. I think so. It makes it a little bit more fun to use for sure.
Definitely. No, no, that sounds great. And lastly, what about this frame makes it your favorite frame?
Wow, I think yeah, I think it's a combination of that, the lighting and the color. Like I'm seeing it here on my screen, and my eye just goes to that key that's completely exposed in the lighting. So my eye goes to there, and then explores everywhere else with the tiny hints of light and whatnot. One that I really like is the reflection that's on the obscure side of the product. I think that's something that really makes it pop out of the background, and it's not something that we get to use very often, just because, like I was saying, clients want to see the products in the best lighting, and usually it's not something like this. Although I think it's been changing a little bit lately with Tendril and studios like 6 and 5 and stuff like that. They're making clients see that we can have a little bit more fun, and people are still going to appreciate and know what your product is. So that's good.
That for sure. No, I think this project, this frame, well, both of these frames really are just amazing. And again,
Thank you.
it just speaks volumes of your work and you as an art director and motion designer and everything. But this has just been so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this project with us, Jesus. If people want to connect with you and learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, I'm still on Instagram, even though it hasn't been very good for us artists lately. But I'm on Instagram as j.suarez with 2 S's in the beginning. That would be the best way to just follow my work. And I'm a little bit active on Twitter. It's j_Suarez with 2 S's as well. And yeah, those two would be the best ones to reach me. And my email is in both of them too, in both my profiles. So feel free to just reach out.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sharing your info and links to some of the resources we mentioned here for our audience to check out. But that wraps it up for today and for this season, everyone. Feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think of the show. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, if you like what you see and hear here, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and review the show on your favorite podcasting platforms as well. And lastly, come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again, Jesus, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for an amazing first season. Have a wonderful holiday season and New Year, and we'll see you in the next one.